Good morning to everyone. This is Angelita Damilig or Angel Damilig from LPU. And before I proceed, let me inform our beautiful audience that today, March 9, 2022, marks the 131st birth anniversary of Dr. Jose Paciano Laurel, as well as the 70th founding anniversary of Lyceum of the Philippines University, the higher education institution Dr. Laurel has founded in 1952, which I am fortunately connected with. So mabuhay! Mabuhay po tayong lahat. Without further ado, allow me to start indulging you with the topic that was given to me, and it is Dr. Jose P. Laurel and his legacy during the Japanese occupation. So here's the outline of my talk. As follows are context or historical context: Jose Paciano Laurel before the Pacific War. We have JPL during the Japanese occupation, and of course, his legacy. For the purpose of uniformity, let me give you a definition of historical context, which is it refers to the economic, political, and social cultural environment of the period under study. This is important because historical context is important because it gauges the important details that need to be examined and analyzed for us to understand or appreciate I should say, the appropriate or significant picture the past wants us to learn. So raising here is the understanding of Laurel's actions vis-a-vis, I should say, his response to the extraordinary difficult situation placed before him during the Japanese occupation. Hence, reviewing the often unfairly, I should say, epithet of a puppet president. So was he a pawn? Was he a puppet? Please join me and unravel the truth behind these misconceptions. So let us then examine the pre-war years, or right before the Japanese occupation, juxtaposing it against our experiences during the occupation years of the Japanese in the Philippines. Okay, so we have two images here, the one to your right and the one to your left. So we have here to your right, this is an editorial cartoon that may say something about the life under an American-sponsored Commonwealth government. So here it depicts Quezon and his support to women suffrage. Now, let me inform you that Laurel, on his first time as senator, sponsored a progressive measure about women's suffrage. So for the first time in 1937, Filipino women could now vote. So such right and other rights they enjoyed during those years were provided in the 1935 Constitution, to which Laurel headed the formulation of Bill of Rights. However, our country, at that time, deemed a political entity, was still under an American flag. So we're still a colony of USA. There were still policies that should be approved by the American president, especially in terms of the economic aspect. Our economy back then was highly dependent on American products. American control back then was inevitable also, and shall I say, could be imposing. Hence, we struggled for our economic development. So as early as 1935 also, rice problem was identified. Okay? Yet, of all those things, no popular resistance known at those times. If we try to summarize the Philippine life during the American hegemony before the Japanese occupation, it was dominated by American culture. Okay? On the other hand, we have a propaganda poster used by a guerrilla movement during the Japanese occupation here depicts the climate during the occupation, wherein there's a presence of resistance, okay, that was felt because of the guerrillas, the bandits posting as the guerrillas, armed goons, and the others. So this was their way of responding the occupiers' daily humiliations, brutalities, and economic hardships. Furthermore, the Japanese during the occupation controlled almost every aspect of our society. Fuel or transport facilities, transportation, production and distribution or rationing of foods, currency were aspects heavily controlled by the Japanese even when the Philippines was granted independence in 1943. When Laurel assumed the office, peace and order situation was worsening. And despite the initial efforts of the Japanese military administration regarding rice or food problem with its positive and negative results, Laurel still faced the crisis when he assumed the office and struggled to get it going. Challenges, more of these challenges would be in his presidency would be more illustrated as we go on. And next, another thing that we have to understand before the occupation and of course during the occupation, it's the Japanese Empire, the Japanese how extent the Japanese Empire. So this image shows the peak of Japanese Empire in 1942. Initially, the expansions were made to fuel Japan's growing industry, hence taking Korea in 1910, Manchuria as early as 1931, and we also have French Indochina in 1940. So other reason was in a form of response to the sanctions made by Western countries to Japan, specifically United States. Then of course, Pan-Asianism ideology in the 1940s and also prior to 1940s has its foothold in this period. Okay, so aside from this historical context, let me also give you a short background of Laurel. So this backgrounder may also help or support our understanding on his actions during the Japanese occupation. So Laurel was born in Tanawan, Batangas, the same hometown of a great mind and a nationalist, Apolinario Mabini, to which his intellectual prowess and irrefutable patriotism gained him to be one of the advisors of Emilio Aguinaldo's revolutionary government. Like Dr. Laurel, Mabini faced extraordinary challenges, struggling not only against the Spaniards, not only the Americans, but also the selfish and greedy Filipinos. So, this one, I retrieved this from Agpalo, Agpalo's book Prodea et Patria, the political philosophy of Jose P. Laurel, and I quote, and it says here, the Laurel relates himself to Tanawan and Mabini when Dr. Laurel wrote this one. So let's see how Dr. Laurel's understanding to Mabini. It might be due to the circumstances that having been born and raised in the same hometown as our peerless Apolinario Mabini, the sublime paralytic of our history, who is perhaps the greatest Filipino nationalist intellectual produced by our race so far, I early imbibed from the very atmosphere I breathed in childhood and the clear-headed, courageous, and passionate love of country of the hero of Tanawan, end of quote. So that's how he hailed Mabini, and that's also how significant the influence of hometown and of course Mabini was to him. And equally significant was the role played by his parents, the nurturing Doña Jacoba Garcia, and a deeply involved Philippine Revolution personality in the person of his father, Sotero Laurel. So Sotero Laurel was actually an Undersecretary of Interior under Emilio Aguinaldo's revolutionary government, and he was also a delegate to the Malolos Constitution, who's also a signatory to the of the Malolos Constitution. So his bond with his father might be short-lived due to his father's death, but definitely the seed of nationalism was entirely sown. Okay, his educational background consists of a law degree at University of the Philippines in 1915, wherein he graduated second among his class and earned the best thesis of that year. He placed, by the way, second in the 1915 bar examination. He also schooled at Escuela de Derecho, which he obtained a degree of Licenciado en Jurisprudencia in 1918, and that same year he was offered a pensionado at Yale University. And in 1920 at Yale University, he obtained a degree of civil law. And before returning home, he went also to Europe for special courses, specifically at Oxford University in England and Sorbonne University in Paris, France. So because of his love for law, social sciences, and humanities, his studies in and outside the Philippines provided him his political and social ideas, provided him political and philosophical social ideas from both Oriental and Western perspectives. There were also personalities that he met and worked with that I believe advanced his academic and professional understanding of law and other disciplines. So one of which is Thomas Atkins Reeds, who is Laurel's superior at the Code Committee from 1912 to 1915. It was Thomas Atkins Reeds who ingrained the concepts of constitutionalism, the humanistic approach of law, and his beliefs of truth, justice, and scholarship in Laurel Jr. years. So he was also under George Malcolm, who was a former Chief Justice of the Philippine Supreme Court, and was then a professor and dean of the College of Law when he studied at UP. And they even collaborated in writing a book entitled The Philippine Constitutional Law. He was also under former President and former Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, William Howard Taft, when he was at Yale University. So impressive personalities that he met and worked with. The books, actually a lot of books were written even before the occupation. There were a lot of books that were written by our Dr. Jose Paciano Laurel. Some of these, we have election law, and as I mentioned a while back, the Philippine Constitutional Law, which he collaborated with Malcolm, the local government in the Philippine Islands, and assertive nationalism. So his ideas of moral and political philosophy were actually enshrined on the books he has written since pre-war. So meaning to say, when he assumed the office in 1943 as president of the Second Philippine Republic, he has already this political, moral and political philosophy in him. So no wonder in his presidency, he actually applied it. Those ideas that are applicable in his presidency. His work experience, well, of course, provided him a rich opportunity to interact with different people while learning the dynamics of each position and its functions, especially when he started working in the government branches. Now, as public servants. His work, as public servant. His work experience started at Bureau of Forestry, earning 40 cents per half day in 1909. He was still, high school at the time. Code Committee, Executive Bureau, and in 1922 became an undersecretary of the Department of Interior. So this picture was when he was an undersecretary of the Department of Interior. But it was on February 1923. So this is actually before the war already. He was appointed by Governor General Leonard Wood as Secretary of Interior. However, he did not stay long in his position because of the improper interference made by Governor General Wood on the Ray Conley case. Okay? So who's Ray Conley? Ray Conley was an American policeman who was charged of bribery, found guilty by the office of Laurel. What happened was Conley appealed to Governor Wood, and to the surprise of many, especially the Filipino officials, including Dr. Laurel, Conley was reinstated. He was granted reinstatement. So because of this, what would be your feeling if you're Laurel at that time? You found that this guy was guilty of, this guy is guilty of bribery, and then your main boss would have to say that, you have to reinstate this one. What would be your feeling? I think Laurel was saddened at that time and infuriated. Hence, he resigned. This was considered to be a show of courage. More so, this upholds the dignity of the Filipino people, not minding the loss of his position. Okay. So his resignation, by the way, precipitated the cabinet crisis of 1923, where almost all cabinet members of Governor General Wood resigned, including Osmeña, Quezon, Rojas, Abad Santos, among others. So when he resigned, he went back to practice law. But in 1925, he was elected as a senator. So he served as a senator representing the 5th District, so composing of Tayabas, Batangas, Quezon, Mindoro, and Marinduque. In 1928 to 1931, he was the Senate Majority Floor Leader. Once again, he's working as a public servant. Okay? So, in 1934, he was elected one of the delegates of the 1934 Constitutional Convention. Okay? So, when Americans recognized a Philippine independent mission headed by Quezon and offered us the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which of course ratified by the Filipino people and approved by the American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Filipino legislators acted outright the significant provisions stipulated in the act. So one of which is the drafting of a new constitution by Filipinos, hence a constitutional convention. And as I told you a while back, Laurel was elected as a delegate, or he's one of the delegates of the 1934 Constitutional Convention. Okay? But in 1936, he was appointed by President Quezon as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. So from executive as a cabinet member to legislative as a senator, and now under judicial department as an associate justice. So 3 branches of the government, Laurel has its he has this experience of these 3 branches of the government already, even before his presidency. So one of the controversial issues or cases that he handled was the Ferdinand Marcos murder case. So the Supreme Court overturned the murder conviction primarily because of Associate Justice Laurel, and he raised the importance that this country desperately need young people with the leadership potential and intellect that Marcos has just displayed. So to cut it short, Marcos at that time was acquitted. So Justice Laurel served the High Court under 1941. So let's see what's happening to the western part of the world back then. Prior to 1941, there was already an outbreak of war in Europe. So this was when Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, and France and Britain responded with their declaration of war against Germany on September 3, 1939. So United States back then remained neutral for 2 years. Japan, with fear to be a puppet state of Germany because of its increasing great military power, and Japan posing as the leading actor of Pan-Asianism ideology, signed a military alliance with Germany and Italy called the Tripartite Act. With Germany's invasion of France and the Netherlands, Japan started to expand its empire to the French Indochina, the Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and possibly also Thailand. Okay, here's a map of the territorial expansion of Japan from 1931 to 1942. So Korea was invaded by Japan in 1910. By the way, invasion of Manchukuo or Manchuria started in 1931, as I mentioned earlier. Some parts of the China were invaded by Japan by Japan in 1937, and Nanjing was one of which, hence the rape of Nanjing. Expansion of French Indochina started in 1940, until the United States started imposing an oil embargo against Japan. Is freezing also Japan's assets in the United States and demanding Japan to remove his presence to China and French Indochina. Meanwhile, so all these things are happening. Meanwhile, on November of 1941, there was this general election. So another landslide victory for President Quezon and Vice President Osmeña. So this was also the month where Philippines announced that whatever country US considers an enemy, Philippines also considers that country an enemy. The other picture to the left, it's in Marikina, the Quezon's Marikina residence, together with, so Quezon was there together with his cabinet members. So before Japan made a response to US embargo and demands, Jose Paciano Laurel was appointed by Quezon as Secretary of Justice in 1941. So vacating his position as justice in the Supreme Court because as I mentioned, he was sworn in to be the Secretary of Justice. So the other photo, as I mentioned, it's the residence, Marikina residence of Quezon. Until Japan responded against the United States. I still remember the oil embargo, the freezing of assets, and the demand that US would have to, Japan would have to take all, its presence to China and French Indochina. So this was the response of Japan. With its sneaky attack in Pearl Harbor, the US naval base, on December 7, 1941. Then 8 or 10 hours later, the Japanese attacked the different airfields and other bases of US in the Philippines. Okay, so they're after US, and their US, Philippines was also a colony of US back then. So the Philippines was also being attacked. At the same time, Philippines is in Southeast Asia. So Japan attacked the Philippines also. So that was December 8, 1941. The Filipino and American troops were overwhelmed with the attack of Japan. Sensing its unpreparedness, MacArthur ordered them to move to Bataan. So the Filipino and U.S. forces were ordered to move to Bataan. Quezon and a handful of his cabinet members of his choice shall evacuate and proceed to Corregidor. Manila was declared open city on December 26, 1941 to spare Manila from destruction. Okay, so we were being attacked already by Japan. Okay. Then here's, shall I say, controversial picture, and also it posed the question, what was said in Marikina? Okay, so in this photo shows the meeting of Field Marshal and USAFE General Douglas MacArthur with President Quezon, Executive Secretary then turned Greater Manila Mayor Jorge Vargas, and Secretary of Justice Laurel. Originally, Laurel was one of the cabinet members handpicked by Quezon to join him in Corregidor, but the following day, instead of Laurel, Quezon decided the newly appointed Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos to go with him. So it was clear, however, that there would be government officials who would face the Japanese. So this difficult task was handed over to Greater Manila Mayor Jorge Vargas and Secretary of Justice Jose Paciano Laurel. Could you imagine their situation at that time? Not only their life was at stake, but the possibility also to be tagged as someone who might take a step that might be interpreted as against the will of the government in America. And another question, why Laurel to be part of an official who would be facing also the Japanese? So Laurel was considered a logical choice because of his affiliation to some of the Japanese officials. Some clients back then, when he was practicing law, were Japanese companies. And he also sent one of his sons, Jose Sotero Laurel III, also known as Pepe, to study at the Japanese Imperial Military Academy from 1934 to 1937. Adding more, Secretary Laurel was conferred honoris causa by Tokyo Imperial University in 1938. But the question really and very, shall I say, controversial and intriguing, the answer to the question of this from the Laurel's camp: what are we going to do when the Japanese come in? So that question, more intriguing and very important, because these answers were used in defense of Vargas and Laurel in the future. The question from Laurel's camp: what are we going to do when the Japanese come in? So here's the instruction made by MacArthur and Quezon. You must do, this was from MacArthur, you must do anything the Japanese ask you to do except one thing, that is to take an oath of allegiance to Japan. That's from MacArthur. Quezon's instruction is to do everything you can to mitigate the suffering of the people. In Tagalog, gawin ang lahat upang maiwas sa kapahamakan ang mga mamamayan. So these were the important instructions that were given to Secretary Laurel and Mayor Vargas. This may mean the possibility to serve the Japanese to cushion the effect of Japanese occupation among the Filipino people. Putting yourself in their shoes, Easy? Difficult? Extraordinary difficult? One thing for sure for me, that would be difficult. Extraordinary difficult. By the way, from the correspondence of David Steinberg to Douglas MacArthur in 1961, asking if MacArthur ordered Vargas this kind of instruction, MacArthur said no. However, MacArthur was known to be a master of lies, according to Mr. James Sobel. He's an American archivist of MacArthur Memorial Archives and Library. He's not actually related to the Sobels in the Philippines because he's an American working under the MacArthur Memorial Archives and Library. So, let's proceed. So, hours before the departure of Quezon and his company to Corregidor, on December 24, 1941, President Quezon sworn Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos, and with them were former Executive Secretary and now Greater Manila Mayor Jorge Vargas, Secretary of Justice Jose Paciano Laurel, and also with them on the side were Benigno Aquino Sr. and Basilio Valdez. So from December 1941 to January 1942 was the entry of the Japanese Imperial. On December 26, 1941, Manila was declared an open city as planned by MacArthur. On January 2, 1942, Manila was officially occupied by the Japanese. Then the following day, martial law was imposed by the Japanese military administration. On January 23, 1942, the Philippine Executive Commission was created, providing under Order Number 1 of the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese military forces in the Philippines. And Jorge Vargas was appointed as chairman of the Philippine Executive Commission. So, this paradigm shows the central administrative organization imposed by the Imperial Japan to the Philippines. So orders must come from the highest authority, the Japanese Military Administration, to the chairman of the PEC or Philippine Executive Commission, and through him to the 6 commissioners of the commission, namely Interior, headed by Aquino, Justice by Laurel, Agriculture and Commerce by Alunan, Education, Health and Welfare by Recto, Public Works and Communications by Paredes, and Finance by Sison. However, each commissioner has 2 Japanese advisors, okay? And for obvious reasons, they serve to be the eyes and ears for the Japanese military administration. On January 28, 1942, however, Premier Hideki Tojo, before the Imperial Diet, declared in his address before the Japanese Imperial Diet, did I mention twice? Declared in his address before the Japanese Imperial Diet the huge chance of the Philippines be given an independence. So one statement in his address, and I quote, "Japan will gladly grant the Philippines its independence so long as it cooperates and recognizes Japan's program of establishing a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere." End of quote. By the way, Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere is a fulfillment of the Pan-Asianism ideology of Japan. Hence, the rhetoric Asia for the Asians, extending, of course, the rhetoric to the Philippines as the Philippines for the Filipinos. So because of that, well, of course, there were people who worked so that we would be given that kind of independence. So on December 8, 1942, the Philippine Executive Commission dissolved all political parties, then created one political party, which is the Kalibapi or the Kapisanan sa Paglilingkod sa Bagong Pilipinas. So this was one party system similar to what Imperial Japan observed at the time. The ultimate goal of this was the Philippines' alignment to GIAC-PS, or the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere? I think so. According to Dr. Deviana, a historian, being a member of Kalibapi has economic benefits, like obtaining products with cheaper price like rice, oil, and other foodstuffs. So that's the benefit of being a member of the Kalibapi. So Benigno Aquino Sr. was appointed as the Director General of Kalibapi. Of course, an inevitable change of structure of PEC, or Executive Commission, Philippine Executive Commission, then was expected. Jose Paciano Laurel was transferred from Justice to Interior, so the former commission of Aquino. On May 5 to 7, 1943, Premier Hideki Tojo visited the Philippines. So, parade and banquet were prepared on his visit, and he was pretty happy of what he observed during his visit. Don't you know that Tenno Heika Banzai, which means long live the emperor, or in short Banzai, can be considered as a Japanese patriotic cheer or battle cry, like Russia's Ura. Premier Hideki Tojo thought on his parade he was hearing Banzai from the Filipinos, not knowing that it was the word Bangkay that they were shouting. Right? Since, sometimes Filipinos were funny, and even during those times, Filipinos were resilient and joking around or kidding around. So since overwhelmed with his visit on June of 1943, Japan announced categorically the awarding of independence, independence of the Philippines. Kalibapi was then instructed to form PCPI, which means Preparatory Commission for Philippine Independence, not Please Cancel Philippines, though some Filipinos at that time jokingly uttered it. An important goal of this PCPI was to draft a new constitution for the new republic to be awarded by the Japanese. But by mid of 1943, according to Dr. Ricardo Trota Jose, a war historian, from his case study, and I quote, "The peace and order situation had deteriorated in the mid of 1943, and guerrilla attackers had become bolder, particularly in Manila, with various assassinations and kidnapping occurring." That's why no wonder on June 5, 1943, Laurel was shot at Hole 7 Wak Wak Golf and Country Club. He was badly injured and was brought to the Philippine General Hospital for medical attention. Due to the Japanese military flaws on Laurel's security, Japanese brought great doctors to deal with his fast recovery. This was interpreted as also a turning point to Commissioner Laurel's future undertaking within the Japanese-sponsored government. Why? Because of that assassination incident, he became, shall I say, the talk of the town. Also, Japanese possibly was in conundrum, asking this: what do Laurel possess that Vargas and Aquino may not have? Okay? Concluding it that Laurel must be popular to the people compared to Vargas and Aquino. So, Jose P. Laurel, albeit his condition, he headed the Preparatory Commission for Philippine Islands, with Benigno Aquino Sr. and Ramon Avancenia as Vice President. So, per instruction of the President of the PCPI, some meetings were held at PGH where Laurel was confined. By the way, Feliciano Lizardo was a former boxer turned guerrilla, also known as Little Joe. He was arrested and presented as suspect to the assassination attempt. and having the knowledge of his perpetrator, Dr. Laurel absolved Little Joe. When asked if he's the wood assassin, Dr. Laurel said no to the Japanese. He knew that once he said yes, Japanese may outrightly kill him. So after the war, Little Joe, trivia, became a bodyguard of Dr. Laurel until his death in 1959. Okay? In the newly drafted 1943 Constitution, emphasis on more power should be given to the chief executive, and also emphasizing the responsibilities and obligations of the people instead of rights and privileges of people. The 1935 and 1943 Constitution, it's quite similar, except of these two important provisions giving emphasis on more powers to be given to the executive, and also the responsibilities and obligations of the people instead of rights and privileges of the people. This 1943 Constitution will only exist during wartime. So if it's peacetime already, this war or 1943 Constitution would be dissolved. Japanese wanted to include, in the drafting of this 1943 Constitution, Japanese wanted to include military conscription. But Laurel, as the head of PCPI, categorically said no. Perhaps the negotiation, the goodness and the greatness of Laurel's negotiation did not fail because there was no military conscription. So on September of 1943, there's this the newly draft Constitution was presented to the PCPI and eventually conducted a General Assembly. So with the creation of National Assembly in 1943, having governors and city mayors as its composition on September 25, 1943, Jose Paciano Laurel was unanimously elected as president by the members of the National Assembly. Okay? Then on September 29, then 30, 1943, Laurel, Aquino, and Vargas was summoned to go to Tokyo. Other accounts says it's 29, other accounts says it's 30 of 1943. Well, what's important is they were being summoned to go to Tokyo. So, with Premier Hideki Tojo or Premier Hideki Tojo in the meeting, they were surprised. Surprised because they were asked to declare war against United States and Great Britain. Again, if you're in their shoes, especially President Laurel, how will you react? You are inside their territory, having their soldiers with them and asking you something to their favor. One thought could be your uncertainty to return to the Philippines alive. So let's see the reaction of President Laurel when he had this meeting with Premier Hideki Tojo. So here's actually the statement of President Laurel in his words. It was a shock to all three of us. We did not expect this instruction and we were not prepared to meet it on the spot. I silently prayed the Pater Noster. Right? And he said after the translation by Hamamoto of the speech of the Premier, he got up slowly and politely, or he got up to say this one as politely as he could, that according to Laurel, I could not comply with the request, and I said, or Laurel said, that his people would not approve of it, that he could not carry them, that he could never be a popular leader, and that the Filipinos will not abandon America as their ally. Okay? So, according to him also, only unworthy people could be expected to declare war against Britain, against US and Britain. So, Premier Hideki Tojo was rejected of this. But still, Tojo then offered the party sums of monies necessary for the achievement of independence. But Laurel turned down the offer. Tojo again asked Laurel what he could do. And then Laurel said they needed an airplane to take them home. So fortunately, Laurel, Vargas, and Aquino returned home. Oh, on October 14, 1943, it marked the inauguration of the Second Philippine Republic. It was held in front of the Legislative Building. Bishop Guerrero led the invocation. The Philippine flag was once again allowed to be displayed since April of 1942. No other flags were hoisted that day but the Philippine flag. It was hoisted by the former Revolutionary General Artemio Ricarte and former President of the First Philippine Republic, Emilio Aguinaldo. President Laurel took his oath of office or panunumpa sa katungkulan in Tagalog. Chief Justice Jose Yulo officiated the oath of office. Afterwards, after the taking oath of office, the President Laurel delivered his inaugural address. His moral and political ideas were integrated in his address. Allow me to read to you the final line of his inaugural address, which I think encapsulated an important statement asking the Filipino people to work for a stable, lasting, and real independence. And I quote, "Every drop, every trickle of individual effort shall be grooved into a single channel of common endeavor until they grow into a flowing stream, a rushing cataract, a roaring torrent, a raging flood, hurdling all difficulties and demolishing all barriers in the way of our single purpose and common determination to make our independence stable, lasting, and real." Just imagine this line was authored albeit the presence of the Japanese. Such courage, isn't it? That afternoon, however, the newly installed Second Philippine Republic faced an external pressure in which the government must sign the Japan-Philippine Pact of Alliance. Terms of understanding include the close coordination between Japan and Philippines in terms of politics, economy, and military. Rumors started to spread and created fear, especially among Filipino men. Now, to end the rumors spreading at the time, President Laurel issued a statement, and I quote, "The pact does not envisage a declaration of war by the Philippines against any foreign nation. No Filipino soldier will be called upon to render military service outside the limits of Philippine territory or to fight except for defense purpose." End of quote. Now, to simply put it, he stood for no military conscription. Okay? So this paradigm shows the hierarchy of power during the Second Philippine Republic or the Second Sponsored Republic. The president being the highest, he together with his working commission. So there should be an arrow from Jose P. Laurel to Benigno Aquino. So he together with his working commissioners lobbied to work independently, even if others may say that the kind of independence they're working was a sham independence. Even calling it as such, nevertheless, I think this brought President Laurel and the government an opportunity to change what needed to be changed for the reason of guiding people to better times, and equally important, to be independent without any external forces including or influencing, I should say, the affairs of the country. Struggles indeed were difficult and real, but the president kept going on. Here were the pressing challenges faced by the Republic, in which examining it closely were interrelated. And I would also be mentioning responses done by the presidency of President Jose Paciano Laurel. First is the presence of the increasing number of Japanese in Manila. The presence of Imperial Manila, or Imperial Army I should say, and Navy, including the Japanese Embassy in Manila, especially in 1944, more so that Manila was made to be the Japanese headquarters of their Southern Army. Southern Army was their Japanese troops found in Southeast Asia and New Guinea. So greater number of Japanese population equates to more Japanese to be fed. So the possibility of Japanese at the time to use their Japanese first policy card just to get what they need or want, especially in their rationing or procurement of food. Okay, so this one, I cannot forget this story we're in, because this Japanese military army, the Kempei Tai, one of which is the Kempei Tai, no? They never failed also to pressure and even intervene government affairs. Like this instance. In one instance, Kempei Tai stormed Malacanang with Kihara Jitaro, insisting that he could be the advisor of President Laurel. But the President Laurel, answered him, and I quote, I could be your advisor, Kihara, but you cannot be my advisor, so you had better get out. So President Laurel, at that time also General Kuroda, and complained about the Japanese guards, no? The Japanese guards' presence in Malacanang. He insisted to have Filipino guards only in Malacanang. So by that time, Malacanang became then the bastion of the Philippine Republic, as Dr. Jose, a Filipino war historian, has put it. So just imagine stating all this one to the Japanese faces. So another incident was when Manuel Rojas was implicated of assisting the guerrillas. So what he did, he held Rojas in Malacanang. And when the Kempei Tai, the Japan's military police, they asked for the body of Manuel Rojas, President Laurel refused steadfastly to hand over Rojas to the Kempei Tai. Okay. Second challenge could be the guerrilla movements and even the unorganized groups. So the guerrillas are organized groups, may it be Filipinos, Americans, or even Chinese who were serving, of course, their purpose. There were also bandits posting themselves as guerrillas, so they also inflict damage and worsen the situation. These groups have provided resistance against the Japanese and supporters of the Japanese. However, may it be organized or not, it worsened the peace and order of the country. Kempei Tai versus guerrillas or Makapili versus guerrillas. Innocent civilians were caught up in between. So of this situation, who would want to plant or harvest rice, vegetable, or any other crops in the field? So as a response to the worsening peace and order situation, President Laurel strengthened the Filipino recruitment of Bureau of Constabulary. So this bureau oversaw the peace and order in the country. This was also a way to depopulate Japanese army in the Philippines. So President Laurel also offered amnesty to the guerrillas. Okay, so that's the response with regard to the problem of peace and order staged by guerrillas and even unorganized groups. Diseases also, like beriberi, dysentery, and dengue fevers were common, especially on prison camps like UST camp. Shortage of food among the populace made it more difficult to alleviate the worsening diseases, especially especially the endemic diseases. And as a response to this challenge, President Laurel created a Council of Scientists and Research Advisory Board. So he ordered the members to invent a locally resourced medicine essential at that time. Okay? Another challenge is hunger, or the rice and food problem. Hyperinflation on the side, wherein many Filipinos experienced hunger and starvation during the Japanese occupation. We were not self-sufficient in the production of rice before the pre-war or before the occupation. It worsened when the Japanese occupied our country. Although efforts were done initially by Japanese military administration to ameliorate the situation, like introducing Horai rice from Formosa, building irrigation systems, even inviting a Japanese expert of irrigation system to assess and build irrigations, it went well for a short period of time but unsuccessful for the longer period of the Japanese occupation. Adding more the strong typhoon and floods in 1942 and 1943 respectively, which added the worsening of the rice problem. Also, to the lack of cooperation among Filipinos who were observed or these were actually observed during the occupation of the Japanese. So as a response to this challenge, Food Administration was created. So NARICA, or National Rice and Corn Corporation, at first was the government agency responsible for the procurement, rationing, and the control of price. When assessed as ineffective, BIBA, or the Bigasang Bayan, was created. So this time, Japanese were not allowed to have their fair share in the rationing. Then, when it failed, there was this creation of RICOA, or the Rice and Corn Administration. So all these were efforts made by the Second Philippine Republic to improve the situation of the country's food problem. However, because of drought in 1940, strong typhoon in 1942, floods in 1943, proliferation of black markets, armed goons, and bandits as thieves in the presence of guerrillas, especially in Central Luzon, the Japanese control of transportation, fuel, currency, and other institutions, the Filipinos' lack of cooperation because perhaps of distrust, did not ultimately solve the problem. So President Laurel, emphasizing with the people, live simply. No lavish parties were allowed in Malacanang. No gift given to the president. Dishes were limited, and other austerity measures that they've done. Okay. Now, another one is espionage, which is actually the use of spies for spying. So there were the Filipinos who were paid by the Japanese to spy anyone or everyone to serve the interests of the Japanese. Makapili, or Makabayang Katipunan or Kalipunan ng mga Pilipino, was an independent body of the government that was created on December 8 of 1944. President Laurel at that time was forced to be present in the inauguration of Makapili. Artemio Ricarte was actually its head. So this was the response of the Japanese against American air raids and Filipinos cooperating with the Americans in 1944. So in this system, many were implicated. Even innocent people were not spared. So as a response, Bureau of Investigation was created to serve its purpose. Also, there were detainees who were held in an area, but when President Laurel has this knowledge, I should say, he released them. So aside from these challenges and responses that were provided by the presidency of Dr. Laurel during the Japanese occupation, there were other efforts done by his presidency. So one of which is the creation of central bank to solve the problem of high inflation in the Philippines. So we all know that the Japanese controlled the currency, hence the so-called Mickey Mouse money. So, creating a central bank, he envisioned that there would be a day, someday we could mint our own money without already the control of the Japanese, and it would help the inflation of the Philippines. Another one is the National Education Board, wherein it stressed the makabayang curriculum, the use of Tagalog as the medium of instruction, and once again celebrating the culture and arts of the Philippines, like the cultural renaissance or the cultural revival back then when he was the president of the Second Philippine Republic. Okay. Observed also as lacking and essential at that time was a functioning diplomatic establishment. So they created a functioning diplomatic establishment or relations. These were in place. So some of them were as follows. You have the Greater East Asia Conference that happened, held on November 5 to 6, 1943. So this was an opportunity of President Laurel's attendance to the Greater East Asia Conference on November 5 to 6, 1943 at Tokyo, Japan. This conference was tagged also sa Tokyo Conference. Now, others claim that this conference was staged to prove that Japan was true to the Pan-Asianism ideology and show to the world that Japan, as a liberator of Asia from Western imperialism, and Asians are united against Western imperialism. But for the Republic, of course, it was meant for diplomatic relations among the other countries present on that said conference. So there was also Philippine Gratitude Mission to Japan, in which it aimed not only to speak gratitude to Imperial Japan, but more on to lobby a true independence for the Philippines. There was also the creation of Foreign Ministry or Ministry of Foreign Affairs that was headed by Minister Claro M. Recto. So it aimed efforts among countries to recognize the Philippines as a sovereign country. Philippine Embassy also in Tokyo was established. It was headed by Ambassador Jorge Vargas. And then here comes September of 1944. Americans bombed Manila. With Japan's pressure and the brilliance of Laurel and his ministry. So despite of the pressure of Japan, President Laurel declared a state of war exists between the Philippines and the United States and Great Britain. State of war and not declare of war. So state of war exists. So state of war exists instead of declaring a war. State of war exists meant as a matter of fact. Okay, so the Japanese or the Japanese or the United States failed to understand this one, because for them it's similar, it's the same. But what important here also is the Japanese, on the other hand, failed to understand the content of the proclamation. That proclamation signed by Jose Paciano Laurel, there's absence of military conscription, or there's no military conscription. So this was proclamation number 30 signed by President Laurel, and then this was an excerpt from the proclamation, and I quote: "Now, therefore, I, Jose P. Laurel, President of the President of the Republic of the Philippines, do hereby proclaim that a state of war exists between the Republic of the Philippines and the United States of America and Great Britain, effective September 23, 1944, at 10 o'clock in the morning." So, end of quote. So there's also a legal implication of, or legal infirmity of, proclamation number 30 signed by President Laurel. In legal parlance, this document be considered unconstitutional or invalid. Why? Because according to Section 12 of Article 2 of the 1943 Constitution, President could only declare a war with the concurrence of 2/3 votes of the members of the National Assembly. So before issuing Proclamation number 30, there was Proclamation number 29 that was released on September 21 of 1944. And its effectivity, it's 9 a.m. of September 22, 1944. So Proclamation number 39 was the proclamation of martial law or declaring martial law throughout the Philippines. So because of this, many members of the National Assembly returned to their province or hometown, and some were into hiding already. But President Laurel and the other members, who by the way lacked quorum at the time, staged a meeting, obviously for a show. So it was on September 22, 1944, that President Laurel issued Proclamation number 30. And according to Dr. De Viana, a historian, the issuance of Proclamation number 30 could mean Laurel wanted him only to be responsible for such action, hence the non-participation, or he did not include the members of the assembly. So if I may add what Dr. De Viana mentioned, he's also a selfless, and that decision is actually a righteous act. Okay? So on December 1944, the Japanese frustration with the action of Laurel regarding the no military conscription was apparent. So Japanese responded with the creation of Makapili. So this was also in response to the continuous air raids and bombings made by the Americans in Manila, until President Laurel was evacuated from Manila to Baguio with, of course, the instruction of the Japanese. So with the liberation of Manila in March 3, 1945, the Japanese decided that President Laurel be evacuated to Japan. So from Baguio to Tuguegarao, Cagayan, then Tuguegarao to Formosa, and finally Formosa to Japan. So on from June to August, President Laurel was actually in Nara Hotel in Nara Prefecture. But on August 15, 1945, the surrender of Imperial Japan to Allies. So they surrendered already to the Allied forces. So when Allies, they surrendered after the Allied dropped atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945 respectively. So on August 17, 1945, President Laurel issued a statement that the Second Philippine Republic has ended. Okay. Now, I started my talk. So that's the end of the Japanese occupation in the Philippines. And that's also the end of the Second Philippine Republic, because President Jose Paciano Laurel issued already a statement. Okay. I started my talk with a historical context and a background of Dr. Laurel, even his pre-war experiences were included. My purpose for this is for us to connect the factors, concepts, and stories that made his actions justifiable and commendable, despite the internal and external pressures of the occupation, and our country was just caught up between the two warring powerful countries. So on his actions during the occupation, I think he only upheld Philippine independence as Philippine president. Imagine refusing the request of Japan to declare war against US and Great Britain right before his inauguration, refusing military conscription even a state of war exists between the Philippines and United States and Great Britain, refusing to hand over Rojas to Kempeitai because he knew he'd be dead if he allowed him to be taken away, refused to have his Japanese advisor as the president of the Philippines, refused to have his speeches edited, actions that were taken detrimental to the Japanese interest, yet solidarity for fellow Filipinos, namely meeting with some guerrillas at the Malacanang Palace, offering amnesty to guerrillas, releasing detainees, and pardon even pardoned a guerrilla member who wanted to assassinate him. He also insisted to the Kempeitai High Command to get rid of the Japanese guards in Malacanang, and only Filipino guards were allowed. These and other actions were observed to uphold independence in the truest sense of the word, even in the most uncertain time. So through this, we may understand his story, devoid from nothing but an accusation of him being a puppet president. He's not a puppet. He's not a pawn. This president, Jose Paciano Laurel, was neither a puppet nor a pawn, but a man with his independent stance guided by his moral and political philosophies, and of course, for his love of his country. Having said all of this, what legacy could we derive from Dr. Jose Paciano Laurel during the Japanese occupation? Fortitude, unwavering nationalism and independence, and the lives he saved and protected. Fortitude because he exemplified the courage to stand in the name of truth, justice, and goodness. His unwavering nationalism and independence because he never failed in propagating and inspiring strong nationalism and independence to whatever departments or ministries in the government at that time, and even in his relationship with the community or the society. For me, he's a thinker, a talker, and a doer rolled into one as he relieved his ideas and ideals of nationalism and independence every time he was called for. And finally, the lives he saved and protected. His leadership was meant to protect and save Filipinos. Even his own life was at stake. There might be a chance that some of us are alive today because we were saved and protected by President Laurel. How? How come? Well, of course, by not allowing our lolos, our grandparents, into military conscription during the Japanese occupation. Come to think of it. So let me end my talk citing two quotes of Dr. Jose Paciano Laurel. This one, the first one is this: I am neither pro-Japanese nor pro-American. I am pro-Filipino. And lastly, no one can love the Filipinos more than the Filipinos themselves. From Dr. Jose Paciano Laurel. So thank you very much, and always stay free.